There's a smell that belongs to this land. Pine tar, machine oil, cold creek water. I've known that smell my whole life. It means home. It means safety. It means the 34 acres my grandfather, Harlan Wexford, bought in Callaway County, Virginia in 1952 when he was 23 years old, fresh out of the army, with hands that had never been soft and a stubbornness that no amount of hardship had ever managed to wear down. He cleared every tree himself, built the farmhouse plank by plank, planted the black walnut grove that still stands today along the eastern fence line, trees so old now that their roots have memorized the shape of the soil. He named the creek that ran through the southern edge of the property Millstone Run, because the first time he walked its banks, he found an old grinding stone half buried in the clay, left behind by someone who'd worked that same ground before him. He liked that. The idea of continuity, of one man's work outlasting him and becoming part of someone else's story. My grandfather built his life on that land, raised a family on it, and in 1989, when the county's original culvert crossing washed out in a summer flood that took half the low road with it, he built something else, a drawbridge. Not a metaphor, an actual drawbridge, spanning 28 feet over Millstone Run. Steel I-beams sourced from a salvage yard in Waynesboro, hand-laid plank decking, each board measured and set by Harlan and his farmhand, a quiet, capable man named Decker, who had been working the property since 1981. A hand-crank hydraulic lift mechanism that Harlan designed himself on graph paper at the kitchen table, drawing on 3 decades of structural work with the Army Corps of Engineers. The county granted a road easement across it. That meant the public could use it for passage, but every bolt, every beam, every plank of that bridge belonged to Harlan Wexford. His land, his bridge, his rules. For years, that distinction meant nothing in practice. The road on the far side of the bridge led to open farmland and timber lines. A few neighbors used the crossing, an occasional delivery truck, the mail carrier on Tuesdays. It was quiet, the way land that hasn't been noticed yet is always quiet. Then, Crestfield Commons arrived. In 2019, a development company called Meridian South Properties broke ground half a mile north of us. By 2021, they had built and sold 260 homes, organized them into the Crestfield Commons Homeowners Association, and handed enforcement authority to a private security outfit called Crestfield Community Standards and Security, known locally, when it was known at all, as CCSS. CCSS drove white Ford F-250s, spotless, like they'd been delivered that morning. They enforced community standards with a thoroughness that impressed some residents and quietly terrified others. Wrong-colored landscaping mulch, unapproved flagpoles, trash cans visible from the street past 8 a.m. on collection day. Their director was a woman named Meredith Calder. She was 53 years old, sharp-featured, always dressed like she was conducting an official inspection, even when she was just refilling her coffee at the gas station on Route 11. She had the very particular energy of someone who had spent years being told she didn't have enough authority and recently, finally, received some. She had memorized the community standards document the way certain people memorize scripture. She had issued 160 written warnings to Crestfield residents in her first 7 months. She had color-coded her clipboard system. And sometime in early spring, she decided our property was her next project. The first notice appeared on a Wednesday morning in April. Decker found it zip-tied to our fence post when he came out to start his morning rounds. Yellow paper, official-looking font. It cited the lumber stack near our equipment shed as a violation of community aesthetic standards within what the notice called the adjacent corridor zone. Decker read it twice, then he looked up and down the county road. Nobody there, just tire tracks in the soft shoulder where a vehicle had recently stopped. He brought the notice inside and set it on the kitchen table. That evening, my grandfather came home, read it in the fading light without a word, carried it inside, and set it next to his coffee mug. He read it again. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in an empty manila folder on the shelf above his desk. He didn't call anyone in anger. He didn't go looking for a fight. He called me. "Petra," he said. I was living in Charlottesville at the time, working as a paralegal for a small property law firm. "I need you to come home this weekend and bring your reference books." I drove down that Friday evening with the windows cracked, the April air still carrying that particular edge of cold that lingers in the valley long after the calendar says spring. I'd been listening to Grandpa describe the situation on the phone for 2 weeks. The part that worried me most wasn't what he was telling me. It was how calm he sounded telling it. By the time I arrived, 2 more notices had appeared. One cited his equipment shed as a non-conforming structure, despite the fact that it had been standing in the same location for 31 years, long before Crestfield Commons existed on any planning document or plat map. The second notice complained that our 2 dogs were, and I am quoting directly here, unrestrained within the community aesthetic corridor. Our dogs were behind a fence on our property. The community aesthetic corridor was a phrase Meredith Calder appeared to have invented and written by hand in the margin of her clipboard documentation. She had also started the drive-bys, 3 times a day, sometimes 4. Her white truck would roll slowly past our fence line. She would stop. She would photograph whatever caught her attention, the gate latch, the shed siding, the walnut trees along the eastern fence, as if the trees themselves were in violation of something they didn't know they'd agreed to. Some mornings I could smell the diesel exhaust from the kitchen window before I even heard the engine. I spread all 3 notices across the kitchen table under the old hanging lamp and read them carefully. The wood surface was warm and smooth under my forearms, worn down by decades of mail and coffee cups and engine parts and decisions made quietly by people who understood what they owned. Grandpa sat across from me, hands around his mug, watching me read. "You can't enforce any of this," I said. "You're not in the HOA." "I know," he said. I looked up. He was smiling. What I didn't know yet was that my grandfather had already started building his case 3 weeks before I even knew there was a war, and the weapon he was sharpening wasn't a lawsuit, it wasn't a complaint, it was something much older and much more permanent. What he'd already found was sitting in a manila folder on his desk, and it was about to change everything. The smile on my grandfather's face that night at the kitchen table wasn't the smile of a man who had gotten lucky. It was the smile of a man who had been quietly working for 3 weeks while everyone else assumed he was just waiting to see what happened next. Harlan Wexford had never once in his life waited to see what happened next. The first thing he'd done, the same week the notices started, was drive to the farm supply store in town and come home with a Brenton trail camera, weatherproof, motion-activated, nothing complicated. He bolted it to the same fence post where Calder had left her first notice, aimed it at the county road, let it run. 18 days of footage, every vehicle, every timestamp, every license plate, all of it saved to a portable hard drive in his shop. He didn't tell anyone, he just let it record. The second thing he'd done was call the Callaway County Clerk's office and request a certified copy of the original road easement, a 4-page document from 1954, typed on a manual typewriter, describing precisely what the county had the right to use and what it emphatically did not. The road surface across the bridge, yes. The bridge structure itself, the banks, the adjacent property, the fence line, absolutely not. He'd filed the easement copy in the manila folder. He'd labeled it in block letters with a black marker, Calder material. The third thing he'd done was file a formal written complaint with the Callaway County Sheriff's Office, documenting the pattern of conduct and citing 6 specific dates with timestamps pulled from the trail camera footage. The deputy who took the call, a methodical young woman named Satterfield, told him she'd log it. "Log it carefully," Grandpa said. Then Calder escalated. She filed a counter-complaint with the county code office alleging that our fence posts were encroaching on the road easement by 14 inches and demanding a formal land survey at our expense. In her mind, I suspect, she believed this was decisive. Make an old man spend money, tie him up in process, make him feel the weight of bureaucracy pressing down on him until he simply stopped pushing back. The complaint arrived by certified mail on a Thursday. Grandpa signed it, read it twice, and called an old Army contact named Clifton Draper, a licensed land surveyor out of Staunton, who owed him a favor going back about 20 years and never once mentioned repaying it. Clifton drove out that Saturday. He spent 4 hours working the property line in the cool morning air, moving his equipment carefully along the fence with the unhurried precision of a man who has been doing this long enough to find it meditative. His report was unambiguous. Our fence posts were not 14 inches over the easement line. They were 14 inches inside it. We owned more of the road edge than Calder had claimed. The survey cost Grandpa $580. It was about to be worth considerably more than that. Because while Clifton had his equipment out, Grandpa asked him one more question, delivered almost as an afterthought, the way careful men ask the questions they've been thinking about longest. "While you're here," Grandpa said, "run the bridge coordinates too." The result confirmed what he had suspected for years but never formally verified. The bridge over Millstone Run, every plank, every bolt, every hand-welded beam, sat entirely within the surveyed boundaries of our parcel. The county easement granted passage across it. It said nothing about who controlled access to it, who could close it for maintenance, or what rights the bridge owner held when that maintenance became necessary. Grandpa filed the survey with the county that Monday. He put a second copy in the manila folder. He labeled it in the same block letters, Bridge. That night, he called me. I listened to everything he'd done in 3 weeks: the camera, the easement copy, the sheriff's complaint, the survey, the bridge coordinates. When he finished, I said, "Don't do anything yet." I'm still reading. Now, let me be direct with you for a moment, because this is the part of the story that matters beyond the specifics of one family's dispute. A road easement grants the right of passage. That's it. It does not grant the authority over adjacent private property. It does not transfer control of a privately owned structure. It does not give a homeowners association security director the power to issue citations on land that her organization has no legal relationship to. Calder had been operating as though proximity created jurisdiction. It doesn't. And the easement document sitting in Grandpa's manila folder, 4 pages typed on a manual typewriter in 1954, said so clearly in language that required no interpretation. She had been writing her notices in someone else's dining room, and she was about to find out. May arrived hot and insistent, and Calder came with it at full speed. She began working the HOA residents directly. Parking lot conversations, mailbox encounters, quiet comments at the community entrance about how our property was dragging down their corridor's home values. She implied unresolved code issues. She implied our family had refused reasonable attempts at cooperation. None of it was true. All of it was the specific kind of campaign that's difficult to counter because it never commits itself to paper. She also began following Decker. Twice in May, when Decker drove his old truck down the county road for supply runs, Calder pulled her F-250 alongside him and paced him, just rolling at the same speed, watching him through her passenger window. Decker was 62 years old. He had served 2 tours overseas in circumstances considerably more stressful than a white truck rolling beside him on a Virginia county road. He told me later that he just looked back, steady, patient, and that after about a quarter mile, Calder accelerated away. He seemed almost disappointed it had ended so quickly. The HOA board was growing uneasy. Their chair, a retired administrator named Dorothea Hallman, who had a sharp practical mind and a very low tolerance for problems she hadn't personally approved, called Calder in after 3 board members received resident complaints about the treatment of our family. Calder told her our property was a liability concern, that she was protecting community interests. Hallman told her to document everything formally or stop. Calder chose to document. What she filed next was a noise complaint, alleging that Grandpa's 1978 tractor was violating residential noise ordinances. Grandpa appeared before the county code office in his good shirt. He brought his equipment maintenance logs, the tractor's original manual, and a printed decibel reference chart I had prepared, showing the tractor's rated output at various operating distances. The compliance officer looked at the documents for about 4 minutes and dismissed the complaint. Grandpa thanked him, drove home with the windows down, and crossed our bridge with that familiar thump of planks under tires that I had been hearing my whole life. He patted the steering wheel. But here's what neither Calder nor the HOA board knew yet. While she was filing noise complaints and running drive-bys, I was sitting in my apartment in Charlottesville with a highlighter and the Crestfield Commons HOA governing charter spread across my kitchen table. And on the second evening of reading it, I found the sentence that was going to end this. I found it on a Tuesday evening. I had obtained a copy of the Crestfield Commons HOA's governing charter from the Virginia State Corporation Commission's public filing system. It had taken me 20 minutes online and cost nothing. I printed it at the office, brought it home in a manila folder of my own, and read it over 2 evenings with a yellow highlighter and a legal pad for notes. On the second evening, I found the sentence I had been looking for without knowing exactly what shape it would take. The charter defined the enforcement authority of the Crestfield Community Standards and Security Team in geographic terms. It described the territory within which CCSS had the power to act, to issue notices, to document violations, to conduct inspections. That territory ended precisely at the recorded plat boundary of Crestfield Commons. Every power Meredith Calder believed she possessed, every notice she had zip-tied to our fence post, every complaint she had filed with the county, every slow drive-by she had conducted along our property line, existed only within those plat lines. The moment she stepped off Crestfield property onto the county road adjacent to our fence, she had no authority whatsoever. She was a security director who had walked out of her assigned building and started writing citations in someone else's lobby. I called Grandpa immediately. "Every single notice she sent you," I said, "is legally void. She has no jurisdiction outside the plat boundary." There was a pause. "I know," he said. "You knew?" "I suspected. I was waiting for you to confirm." I laughed despite myself. "So everything she's done?" "Keep going," he said. "What else did you find?" I had found one more thing. I had run Calder's professional history through Virginia's Public Court Case Information System, which is accessible to anyone with a browser and enough patience to learn the search interface. What came back were 2 prior civil complaints, both from her previous position as a private security supervisor in the Fredericksburg area. Both had been settled out of court. Both described a similar pattern, a security director targeting specific property owners near roads her team used regularly. Both complainants were older landowners. Both owned property that a developer had wanted access to. The pattern was not subtle, and it was documented. I printed the case numbers and started a new folder. I labeled it History. Let me pause here and give you the legal framework plainly, because this is the part that has implications far beyond our family situation. An HOA's enforcement authority is defined by its governing charter and limited to its recorded plat boundary. Any enforcement action taken outside that boundary is legally void. It carries no weight, and depending on how it's conducted, repeated notices, vehicular surveillance, targeted complaints, it may constitute actionable harassment under Virginia law. Calder hadn't been enforcing community standards. She had been conducting a campaign against a private landowner using the appearance of authority she had never actually possessed. That distinction matters enormously, and it was about to matter in a very specific and very practical way. By midsummer, the situation had developed a new dimension. The Crestfield Commons residents who used the western exit daily, commuters, delivery drivers, the woman named Felicitas who organized the Tuesday morning carpool, had started noticing something. Every time Calder parked her truck on the county road near our fence line for one of her inspection sessions, traffic backed up behind her. The western exit through our corridor was the fastest route to the highway. When Calder was running her operations, people sat in line for 30, 40, sometimes 40 minutes. Detours, late arrivals, the specific sustained irritation of people whose mornings have been made worse by something with a face and a name. 4 residents submitted formal written complaints to the HOA board, not about us, about Calder. Dorothea Hallman called an emergency session and asked Calder to present documentation justifying her enforcement activities on the county road. Calder arrived with a folder. The folder contained the noise complaint that had been dismissed, the encroachment survey that had backfired, and a handwritten note in her own block lettering that read, "Ongoing liability assessment, adjacent corridor, in progress." Hallman looked at it across the table. "Meredith," she said slowly, "this last item is a note you wrote to yourself." Calder told her she didn't understand the scope of the situation. Hallman placed a formal review on the November board agenda. Sensing the ground shifting, Calder changed tactics. She approached 2 board members privately and proposed installing a retractable security gate at the western entrance to the development just inside the plat line where the community road met the county road. She framed it as a safety upgrade. What it actually was, obvious to anyone paying attention, was a control point, a mechanism to give Calder physical authority over the movement of people through the corridor near our property. One board member, a man named Prewitt, agreed to sponsor the proposal. Word reached us within 48 hours. Small counties have long memories and short distances. I was back in Charlottesville when Grandpa called me, and I could tell from his voice that he wasn't worried, he was thinking. He had walked out to the bridge that afternoon and stood on the deck watching Millstone Run run low in the August heat. A great blue heron had been standing motionless in the shallows downstream, absolutely still, the way herons stand as if they have been there since the beginning of time and intend to remain until the end of it. He had called my mother, Sylvie, his daughter, a retired Callaway County Planning Commissioner, and left her a message. She called back the next morning. She had spent the evening reading the 1954 easement document, really reading it, the way a planning commissioner reads a legal instrument, with attention to every subordinate clause. She found the sentence that changed the shape of everything. The easement for road passage across Millstone Run Bridge was non-exclusive and conditional on the bridge remaining in operable condition as maintained by the property owner. As maintained by the property owner. That phrase meant that Harlan Wexler had the legal right to take the bridge out of service for maintenance, repair, or structural inspection at any time he deemed necessary. No HOA gate could touch that right. No board resolution, no community standards review, no Meredith Calder with her clipboard and her color-coded documentation system. The bridge ran on Wexler time. How long could you legally keep it closed? I asked. The easement doesn't specify a maximum time, just says reasonable time for the work being performed. I was quiet for a moment, working through it. Pop, I said slowly, are any of the bridge's mechanical components currently in need of maintenance? He looked over at the corner of his shop. The hand-crank hydraulic control mechanism, original 1989 installation, 35 years of seasons, was sitting right where it always sat. It worked perfectly. It would also be entirely reasonable to service. As I think of it, he said, yes, several components. But before I could get ahead of myself, Mom had found one more thing. Calder's proposed gate sat within Callaway County's designated scenic corridor zone. A permanent access control structure in a scenic corridor required a special use permit from the County Planning Commission, 90-day minimum review, mandatory public comment period. My mother knew every person on that committee. The gate was going to take a very long time to die, which meant Calder was running out of moves, and we were just getting started. But the document that changed everything wasn't in the charter. It wasn't in the easement. It was sitting in a windowless basement room in the old Callaway County Courthouse, in a file that hadn't been opened in 6 years. And when I found it, I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment, because what it said meant that everything Calder had done, every notice, every complaint, every drive-by, had been built on a foundation that the developer itself had known was hollow since the very beginning. I took a personal day from work on a Thursday in September. I drove to the Callaway County Courthouse before it opened and was first in line when the records room unlocked at 8:30 a.m. The room was in the basement, accessible through a side door off the parking lot. It smelled the way courthouse basements always smell. Aged paper, dust, the specific mustiness of documents that haven't been disturbed in years. Fluorescent lights, metal shelving, a folding table in the center with a sign taped to it that said, "Please use flat surface only, no pens." I signed in, requested the Meridian South Properties development file, and spread a county plat map across the table. I was there for 3 hours. What I found in the first hour changed the shape of everything. In 2018, a full year before Meridian South broke ground, the company had submitted a formal application to Callaway County requesting an easement to use Millstone Run Bridge as a permanent secondary exit for the Crestfield Commons development. The application described the western route in detail. It projected daily traffic volumes. It included an engineering assessment of the bridge's load capacity. The county had reviewed the application. The county had denied it. The denial was on record, in plain language, 1 paragraph long. The bridge was private property. A secondary western exit would require use of an alternate route. Meridian South had filed a revised site plan, shifted the secondary exit to an eastern corridor, and moved forward without ever telling their future homeowners, their HOA board, or their security director what the county had said. This meant something very specific and very important. Every time a CCSS vehicle used that bridge, they were using it as a member of the general public under the county road easement, not as a party with any formal relationship to the structure. The HOA had no claim to that bridge, no standing, no authority, not even a basis for requesting emergency access in a legal proceeding. The denied application was proof that they had known this since 2018 and had simply never mentioned it to anyone. I sat back and looked at the ceiling. Then I kept reading. In the second hour, I found a budget amendment buried in the HOA's 2022 charter filing with the State Corporation Commission. The HOA had transferred $49,000 from its restricted capital improvement reserves to cover what the amendment described as unanticipated administrative expenses. Restricted reserves, under the HOA's own governing documents and under Virginia's Property Owners Association Act, cannot be used for operating or administrative expenses. The restriction exists for a specific reason. Those funds belong to the long-term maintenance obligations of the community, not to whatever the board decides it needs money for in a given quarter. What they had done was not a gray area. It was a clean violation, documented, filed, publicly accessible in the State Corporation Commission records for anyone willing to spend 3 hours in a basement looking for it. This didn't give us grounds for immediate litigation, but it gave us something more immediately useful: leverage. The HOA was financially and procedurally exposed. Any formal complaint filed with the State Corporation Commission, and filing one was a straightforward process, available to any Virginia resident, would trigger a compliance review. That review would arrive at precisely the moment the HOA was trying to push a scenic corridor gate permit through a 90-day public comment period. Their attorney would understand what that meant. Their board would understand what that meant. I drove home through the Shenandoah Valley in the late afternoon. The hills were burning orange and copper on both sides of the highway, the particular color the valley turns in September when the light gets low and the leaves are just beginning to turn. I called Grandpa when I reached the Waynesboro exit and laid it out in order: the denied easement, the charter violation, the gate permit roadblock, the 2 prior civil complaints, the survey, the maintenance clause, all of it. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "So, the bridge," he said finally. "The bridge," I confirmed. "And if we close it for maintenance, they have no legal standing to file anything about it?" "They were denied the easement in 2018. It's public record. It has been for 6 years. Another pause. I could hear the creak through his open shop window on the other end of the line. "How long would we need to hold it?" "1 night, I said. "Just 1 night, at the right moment." "I'll need to order some parts for the crank mechanism." "Order them," I said. Now, let me be direct with you again, because there's a principle embedded in what I found in that records room that matters, regardless of whether you ever find yourself in a property dispute. A denied easement application is permanent public record. It constitutes formal legal notice that a party applied for access rights to a specific property and was refused. Any subsequent claim that the same party had an assumed or implied right to that access is directly contradicted by the existence of that denial. You cannot claim you didn't know you needed permission when your own application proves that you asked for it. Meridian South Properties had known since 2018 that they had no right to that bridge as a development asset. They had built an entire community's western exit around it anyway, and they had never told anyone. October in Callaway County is the kind of beautiful that makes you feel slightly smug about living in Virginia. The walnut trees along our eastern fence went yellow, then amber, then the deep brown gold that means the nuts are ready and the season is almost done. Grandpa spent 3 weekends in his shop. He ordered a legitimate rebuild kit for the bridge's original hand-crank hydraulic mechanism, 35-year-old equipment that genuinely needed the attention. He documented every step, dated receipts, a maintenance log written in the same format he'd used during his Army Corps years, a checklist of components photographed before and after inspection, the hydraulic cylinder seals, the pivot pins, the crank housing, the pressure release valve. Every item real, every item documented, every item the kind of thing any responsible owner of a 35-year-old hand-built drawbridge should have addressed years ago. The rebuild kit cost him $360. The documentation cost him nothing but time and care. The fact that the process would also render the bridge mechanically inoperable for a specific 18-hour window was, as Grandpa put it, just good scheduling. We needed one more thing before we were ready. We needed the right night. And the Crestfield Commons HOA was about to hand it to us on their own calendar. We needed 4 allies. We needed them quietly. The first call was to Decker, who needed approximately 25 seconds of explanation before he said, "I'll be there," and hung up. He volunteered to stand on the bank with a lantern on the night in question and look, in his own words, helpful and unhurried. Grandpa told him that was exactly right. The second call was to Clifton Draper, our land surveyor, who agreed to keep his phone on and his truck keys on the kitchen table in case anyone tried to argue property coordinates in the dark. The third call was to Deputy Satterfield at the sheriff's office, who had by now logged 3 separate documented incidents involving Calder's conduct near our property. Grandpa didn't explain the plan. He simply mentioned that he intended to close the bridge for documented maintenance on a Saturday evening in late October, and that he anticipated some objection from the HOA side. She told him to call if anything escalated. He thanked her. "Mr. Wexford," she said, "I've read your file. I think your paperwork is going to hold up just fine." The fourth call was my idea. Ramona Vesper was a staff reporter at the Callaway County Ledger, a weekly paper that had been covering HOA enforcement disputes in the county's newer subdivisions all year. I had spoken with her briefly after her spring feature ran. I called her and told her there would be a property rights development at the Wexford Farm on a Saturday evening in late October, and that she should bring a camera and waterproof boots. She asked what it was about. "Property rights," I said, "and a bridge." She said she'd be there. The maintenance notice was filed with the county road department on a Monday for the following Saturday, 9 p.m. to noon Sunday. Grandpa posted the laminated notice on the bridge railing Wednesday morning. He was not required to notify the HOA. He did not notify the HOA. Someone at the county road department, not maliciously, just in the ordinary way of small county offices where everyone knows everyone's business, mentioned the filing when Calder called in that week about an unrelated road grading matter. She found out Wednesday afternoon. By Thursday, she had the HOA's attorney, a man named Alcott, on the phone. Alcott called me directly. He had found my name in one of Grandpa's prior complaint filings. He was measured and professional. He said the HOA was considering its legal options regarding the bridge closure. I told him the filing was valid, the documentation was complete, and that I would be happy to forward him the 2018 benign easement application from the county records room if he needed it for his review. There was a pause on his end. "I'll call you back," he said. He didn't call me back. He called Calder instead. He told her what he would have told anyone who understood property law. There was no legal mechanism to prevent the closure. The notice was properly filed, the maintenance was documented, the HOA had no formal easement claim from which to argue. Use the east exit. Tell your board. Calder did not tell the board. Calder decided to handle it herself. The rain started at 8:51 p.m., 9 minutes early, as if the weather had been following our timeline and decided to get ahead of schedule. I was in Grandpa's shop when it hit, sitting on a work stool with my folder of documents on my lap and a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. The rain came in sideways off the ridge, the kind of October rain that turns every surface dark and makes the air smell like iron and soaked gravel. It hammered the metal roof in a sustained roar that made you feel protected inside and very aware of anyone who might be outside. Grandpa was already in his maintenance gear. He had spent the afternoon doing exactly what his log described, cleaning the hydraulic cylinder seals, re-greasing the pivot pins, checking the crank handle housing, writing each completed step in his maintenance journal with the same unhurried precision he had once used to document bridge inspections for the Army Corps. At 8:55 p.m., he pulled on his old waxed canvas rain slicker, coffee-colored, stiff with years of weather, and walked out into the dark toward the bridge. I watched him from the shop doorway. Millstone Run was already running fast with the rain. The sound of it rose up through the bridge planks, carrying that cold creek smell, iron and wet leaves, and something older underneath, like stone that has been under water for a very long time. Grandpa fitted the operating handle into the control panel socket and began the sequence he had performed dozens of times over 35 years. 6 turns to release the pressure valve, a full rotation to engage the lift cylinder. The bridge responded exactly as it always had. A groan of steel, a slow, dignified rise, 28 feet of deck tilting toward the dark sky as the hydraulic cylinder extended, the planks going from horizontal to a 45-degree angle over 18 feet of fast-moving water. When it locked into position, he secured the safety pin and removed the handle. He stood there for a moment, rain on his hat brim, creek roaring below, nothing but dark on the other side. Decker materialized out of the shadows with a lantern. "She's up," Grandpa said. "Yep," Decker said. They walked back to the shop together. The lantern swung. The rain came down harder. At 9:38 p.m., headlights appeared on the far bank. Calder's white F-250 came down the county road and slowed as the headlights swept across the space where the bridge deck should have been. She stopped. She sat in the truck for a moment. Then she got out into the rain, walked to the water's edge, and stood looking at the raised bridge. She got back in the truck. She called Alcott. He told her at 9:40 p.m. on a Saturday night in a rainstorm that there was nothing to be done, that he was going home, and that she should use the east exit. She called the county road department's after-hours line. An automated message informed her that road maintenance closures were handled during regular business hours. She called the sheriff's non-emergency line. The dispatcher told her that a bridge closure pursuant to a properly filed maintenance notice was not a law enforcement matter. Then more headlights appeared behind her, a second, then a third. Calder had not been the only Crestfield resident using the western exit that night. One of the drivers was a retired civil engineer named Holbrook, who got out of his car, walked to the bridge railing, read the maintenance notice in the beam of his flashlight, and said, loudly, with the calm clarity of a man who has spent his life reading technical documents, "Paperwork's in order, eastern exit's open." He got back in his car and turned around. Calder did not turn around. She tried to maneuver her truck in the narrow, rain-soaked road. She managed instead to slide the rear wheels into the soft shoulder. In Grandpa's shop, my phone lit up. "Ramona Vesper, on my way, 2 minutes out." I texted back, "Main gates open, park by the shop." I looked at Grandpa. He was pouring coffee. "Cream's on the bench," he said. By 10:20 p.m., the county road had reached the kind of rain-soaked specific absurdity you couldn't have written if you'd tried. Calder's white F-250 was sideways in the soft shoulder, rear wheels sunk into the mud. The 2 HOA residents who had been blocked behind her had given up trying to turn around in the narrow road and were sitting in their cars with their hazard lights blinking, little orange pulses in the dark, steady as a heartbeat. Ramona Vesper was standing on our bank with a weather-resistant camera and the composed, quietly lit expression of a journalist watching a story arrange itself directly in front of her. The raised bridge deck stood against the dark sky at a clean 45 degrees, the maintenance notice fully visible on the railing, the creek silver-black and fast below. She was shooting steadily. Calder walked to the water's edge on her side and called across, "Lower this bridge right now." Grandpa stood on our bank, hands in his jacket pockets, perfectly still. "It's under maintenance," he said. "I am not asking." "The notice was filed Monday. It's posted on the railing you're standing next to. The county road department has a copy. I can lower it. The seals need to cure overnight. It's in the log." "This is deliberate obstruction." "Your developer applied for an easement over this structure in 2018. The county denied the application. That denial is public record, has been for 6 years. The rain filled the silence that followed. "What did you just say?" "County records room, basement level, open Tuesday through Friday. Ask for the Meridian South Properties 2018 easement application file." I watched Calder across the water. Something shifted in her posture. Not a collapse, a recal. Ramona Vesper's story ran in the Callaway County Ledger the following Thursday. 3 photographs. The raised bridge deck against the dark October sky. The maintenance notice sharp and legible in the camera flash. And Calder's white F-250 listing in the soft shoulder, hazard lights still running at some point past midnight. The headline read, Millstone Run bridge closure exposes limits of HOA security authority. The story was thorough, sourced, and accurate. It included the denied 2018 easement application. It included the reserve fund charter violation. It included the 2 prior civil complaints from Calder's previous position. It included a quote from Grandpa's attorney about the geographic boundaries of HOA enforcement power. It included a quote from Holbrook, the retired civil engineer, about the properly filed maintenance notice. The Virginia HOA news aggregator picked it up within 48 hours. Within a week, 4 other Virginia property owners had contacted Ramona with accounts of nearly identical situations in their own communities. Dorothea Hallman announced a formal review of the CCSS security contract. Meredith Calder did not show up to work on Monday. On Sunday morning, Grandpa lowered the bridge at 10 a.m., 2 hours ahead of the maintenance window's scheduled close after completing his final documented inspection and signing off on the hydraulic seal test in his maintenance log. The morning was sharp and clean, that specific quality of light that only exists after a hard October rain, when the sky is a deep washed blue and everything on the ground is still wet and bright. Millstone Run was running high and copper-colored in the thin sun, the walnut trees dripping on both banks. Decker made breakfast in the farmhouse kitchen, eggs and toast and coffee that had opinions. Mom drove up from Charlottesville before noon. I arrived at noon with pastries from the bakery on Route 1 and the state corporation complaint paperwork I intended to file the following week. We sat on the porch in the cold sun and ate and watched the creek. Nobody said much for a while. The bridge sat level and solid across the water, exactly as it had sat for 35 years, looking precisely like what it was, something a man had built with his own hands on his own land that outlasted every attempt to diminish it. The aftermath arrived in stages, the way these things do. Calder tendered her resignation from the CCSS security contract in early November, citing personal reasons. The board accepted it without apparent difficulty. The gate proposal was formally withdrawn. The HOA retained an outside attorney to review whether the security contract needed to explicitly limit its scope to the recorded plat boundary. The review concluded without much drama that yes, it absolutely did, and it should have said so from the beginning. The state corporation complaint I filed in November was accepted for review. In January, the HOA entered into a voluntary compliance agreement, committing to restore the improperly used reserve funds over 18 months and to amend their charter to explicitly prohibit security enforcement activities outside the recorded plat boundary. The amendment passed at their spring meeting with no opposing votes. Some things, once made clear enough, stop being controversial. The following spring, something happened that I had not anticipated. Dorothea Hallman called my grandfather directly, not through attorneys, not through a formal letter, a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that he almost didn't pick up because he was in the middle of adjusting the tractor's fuel line. She was direct. She said the community needed the western access route. She said she wanted it handled properly this time, with documents that reflected reality rather than assumptions. She said she was sorry it had taken this long to have this conversation. Grandpa listened without interrupting. Then he said he'd be willing to talk. Over the course of that spring, our family and the HOA worked with a property attorney to draft a formal limited easement. Proper scope, proper geography, legal language written to reflect what the access actually was rather than what someone had presumed it to be. The easement included a modest annual contribution from the HOA toward bridge maintenance costs. Our attorney drafted it. Grandpa reviewed it. He suggested 3 changes. All 3 were accepted without argument. As a gesture of goodwill, Grandpa donated timber from 2 walnut trees that had come down in a winter storm. The HOA used it to build 2 picnic benches for a small creek access area at the southern edge of Crestfield Commons, where Millstone Run ran shallow and clear along the property boundary. By summer, families were walking down there on weekends. Children were catching crayfish in the shallows. The creek smelled like warm mud and cold stone, the same way it had always smelled, the same way it had when Harlan Wexford first walked that land as a 23-year-old with calloused hands and something to build. In the fall, Grandpa and I established the Wexford Property Rights Education Fund, a scholarship administered through Callaway County Community College for students pursuing paralegal studies or community planning with a concentration in rural property law. The first recipient was a young woman from the western end of the county who had grown up watching her parents navigate a nearly identical dispute with a development company. The scholarship was $2,000 per year. Grandpa spoke at the County Planning Commission meeting where we announced it. He wore his good shirt, he had his coffee, he spoke for about 3 minutes. The best thing I can tell anyone going through something like this is to read the documents, all of them, especially the old ones, the ones sitting in the basement of the courthouse that nobody's looked at in 20 years. The people who wrote those documents were careful, they were fair. They anticipated that things would eventually get complicated, they just didn't know when or how. So they wrote it down clearly and left it there for you to find. He paused. Go find it. I want to leave you with the practical summary of what this story actually demonstrates, because the lessons here belong to anyone, not just people with bridges. First, an HOA's enforcement authority is geographically bounded by its recorded plat. Any action taken outside that boundary is legally void. If you receive a notice from an HOA security team and you are not an HOA member, that notice has no legal weight. Read your documents. Second, a road easement grants passage. It does not grant authority over adjacent property, control over private structures, or standing to oppose legitimate maintenance closures. If your property includes a privately owned bridge within a public easement, the maintenance clause in that easement is yours. Third, a denied easement application is permanent public record. It proves that the applicant had formal notice they lacked access rights. It cannot be undone by subsequent assumption or informal use. Fourth, HOA governing charters and budget filings are public documents filed with your state corporation commission, accessible to any resident. Read them. The information you need is already there. Fifth, the county records room is open to the public. The documents in it have been sitting there for years, sometimes decades, waiting for someone to come looking. Most people lose not because they are wrong, but because they never read the original documents. Grandpa won because he pulled a 1954 easement from a county filing, read it carefully, and found the sentence that the HOA had never thought to look for. The law was always on his side. He just had to go find it. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe, because the next story is just as good.